What we need to see today in this budget update is not just a reckoning of the damage that's been done to the budget or how bad the economy is. We need to know what the government's going to actually do about it. And we need to be careful. The government's going to try and pull a Swiftie today, and they're going to try and pretend that all of this debt that's in the budget is a consequence of the COVID-19 crisis. But the last 7 very difficult months doesn't explain the last 7 years of failures on the economy. Most of the debt in the budget was accumulated before COVID-19, something like 2/3 of it. This isn't their first deficit that they'll be announcing today. It's their 7th and 8th deficits. For all of these reasons, what we're saying is don't just tell people how grim it is, tell them what you're going to do about jobs into the future.
But I mean, it says that it's looking... I mean, you were looking at a $5 billion surplus 12 months ago, and that's completely gone now, as you know, and it's down to a $180 billion deficit. So doesn't that suggest that it's COVID-related?
Oh, look, clearly the COVID-19 health crisis has damaged the budget. We're not contesting that. The point that I'm making is that 2/3 of the debt had accumulated before we'd even heard of coronavirus, before the bushfires and all the rest of it. It's not the first deficit, it's the 7th and 8th deficit. So the point that I'm making really, Pete, for your viewers, is don't be conned today into believing that all of the problems in the economy and all of the problems in the budget are a consequence of 7 months, the last 7 difficult months. Some of these problems have been hanging around much longer than that.
Does the government deserve some credit? It says that its stimulatory measures have saved some 700,000 jobs. So in that respect, would you give some credit?
Oh, look, obviously programs like JobKeeper, they haven't been perfectly implemented, but they're very important. That's the reason why we called for wage subsidies in the first place. It's why we welcomed the government's change of heart on wage subsidies when they announced them. Clearly, some of this massive amounts of money which have been borrowed in the last couple of months are doing some good in the economy because the priority has to be jobs. So clearly, where government is intervening to save jobs, that's a good thing. The big gap is that there doesn't seem to be a plan for jobs into the future when this otherwise welcome support starts to trail away.
When it comes to spending measures, what would you like to see happen now to get more jobs going?
Well, it needs to be a comprehensive plan, but let me give you a couple of examples. Clearly there's a need for the government to step in and build more public housing. There's a shortage of public housing. It's very labour intensive. It has a lasting benefit. You get lots of bang for buck for government investment, so they should be announcing something like that today. Clearly another example is the fact that there's not a settled energy policy means that businesses are reluctant to invest because they don't know what the energy policy landscape is. And that's why we offered to work closely with the government to agree an energy policy which will give business the confidence that they need to start investing again. These are just some examples of the sorts of things we should be hearing from the government. They extended JobKeeper and JobSeeker. That's a good thing. We welcomed that. But there needs to be a plan for creating jobs into the future. Otherwise, all of these hundreds of billions of dollars that they've borrowed will just kick the can down the road and we'll have a problem next year.
Public housing, though, that'd be a state issue, wouldn't it?
Oh, there's a proud history of federal governments intervening, investing in public housing. There's a need there. It's very labour intensive, has a lasting benefit. It's good for the most vulnerable people in our society. It ticks a lot of boxes. That's an example of the sorts of things that the government should be considering. OK,
well, the BCA says that it's calling for a broad-based investment allowance of 20% covering all forms of investment. That's what the Business Council says would help to create some 2 million jobs. Is that something that you would support?
Well, let's have a look at it and let's see what the government thinks about. But clearly there's a massive problem with business investment. It wasn't just created by this health crisis. There was a problem with business investment before, partly because of energy policy uncertainty, which I talked about. But we'd certainly be up for a conversation about ways to encourage more business investment. We took a plan to the last election which had tax breaks for businesses which invest in Australian jobs onshore in Australia. So we'd have an open mind to looking at something like that again, whether it's specifically what the BCA is calling for or something else. Let's have a look.
Just a couple of state issues before you go, Jim. First of all, Victoria it's a long road back, and the Victorian Premier wants to see it in single digits, the amount of infections, before he opens up the borders again. Is that something that you would support, or do you think it needs to be brought forward?
Oh, look, I thought those numbers yesterday in Victoria in particular were really confronting. Victorians are obviously doing it really tough right now, so our thoughts are with them. I think it's important that the decisions on borders and lockdowns and hotspots and all the rest of it are based on, continually updated best medical and expert advice. We've tried to back the premiers in, whether they're Labor or Liberal, around Australia, because they're doing their best to make the right decisions for the right reasons. And so if the Premier Andrews goes down that path, I'm sure it will be based on the right advice.
And would you be expecting further shutdowns in New South Wales? And that means that Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk would be stopping New South Wales travellers from heading in.
I'm sure that's being considered, but I mean, Premier Palaszczuk's done a remarkable job throughout this crisis. She's got a lot of stick when the borders were closed last time. Turned out to be an inspired decision, a courageous decision. And so she's doing an amazing job with it. And I'm sure if any of those kinds of developments which are in the papers today are being contemplated, a bit like other premiers and chief ministers, if she makes that decision, it'll be based on the proper considerations and the right advice. Okay.